have been giving this lecture in IEMed headquarters in Barcelona. So we have to thank IEMed and IBEI for making this connection between both shores of the Mediterranean possible. Let me introduce you to Youssef Cherif. He's a prominent expert of Northern African affairs. He's currently the Deputy Director of the Colombia Global Center based in Tunis. And Youssef comments and writes regularly for important think tanks and for several media outlets such as Al Jazeera or the BBC or France 24. So during the lecture, you can send your questions, of course. For those who are following this through Zoom, you can send your questions through the chat and Youssef will answer them after both lectures. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I will start by giving this very brief update on COVID-19 in the Maghreb, especially on the economic and political consequences of this crisis. Now, what we see, I mean, if we take the general picture is that the southern hemisphere, including Northern Africa, has been less hit than the northern part of the world. But COVID-19 is advancing slowly in the region. In the case of places like Tunisia, Morocco, but even Algeria, it came via tourists or nationals who live in other countries or who visited other countries, especially France and Italy. North Africa today, from Libya to Mauritania, is the worst hit region in the Arab world, according to the official figures we have so far. Because again, here, we cannot fully rely on these, but from what we have today, Northern Africa is much more hit than the Middle East itself. Algeria is on the top with almost 350 deaths and more than 2,000 cases, followed by Egypt. And then we have Morocco and Tunisia with less than 200 deaths so far. And finally, Mauritania with only one reported casualty. And the only country that didn't record any deaths is Libya. But again, we need to be very cautious with what we have as records. In all these countries, there was a series of lockdowns that was implemented since early March. Some of them started in early March, others waited until the end of March. As I said, the situation looks more or less under control when compared to the Northern Hemisphere. It looks quite bad when compared to the Middle East. Libya, although it is, as I said, recording very few cases, and although it's true that very few people visited Libya from abroad due to the civil war that is taking place there, Libya is actually witnessing an increase in the civil war, and with it, an increase in the number of cargo planes coming from the backers of the different warring factions. So we see it's perhaps the only country in North Africa where we see regular flights going in and out from its military airports, especially coming from places like Egypt, Turkey, the UAE, Russia, and even Syria. Some of these places are actually very hardly hit by the coronavirus. And from these countries, not only weapons come, but also mercenaries. And therefore, there is a high risk that COVID-19 is coming or already came to Libya through one of these flights or ships. Stopping it will actually prove very hard, much harder than in other North African countries. So this is more or less the broader situation of COVID-19 in the Maghreb region. Now, when it comes to the economic prospects, and I think this is, as I said, the health situation is more or less under control, but the economic prospects are the most, the worst. So when it comes to growth, Tunisia, for instance, was supposed to record a growth of almost 2.5% this year. Now it's revised to 0.5%. Algeria was supposed to record more than 1.5% growth. Now it's almost 0%. Morocco, from an expectation of 3.2%, went down to almost 1%. Mauritania was supposed to be the place recording the highest growth in North Africa, partly because of the oil and minerals industry. Mauritania was supposed to record something like 7% of growth, something unheard of in the country. But again, it will be revised maybe to around 0%. Now, this means that, like everywhere in the world, actually, the economy in North Africa will shrink in the upcoming weeks, and unemployment will be on the rise. Again, we don't have very clear records like the ones we see today in places like Europe or the US, not least because the informal sector represents more than 50% of the economy in these countries. But there are already a lot of people who are without jobs currently, and they don't have any safety net. The medical coverage is limited, and most of them actually, at least those who live in the informal sector, they live day to day. And as I said, this represents more or less 50% of the population. In figures, actually, the major oil producers like Algeria, meaning Algeria and Libya, based their 2020 budgets on 50% dollar per day. Based their 2020 budgets on $50 per barrel price. Now, as you know, because of the oil crash that is taking place, we're talking about half that price. So this is already one additional issue that they are facing. The tourism hubs, meaning Morocco and Tunisia, were expecting the tourism to grow this year, because not least because of the security advances against ISIS and the collapse of the caliphate. Now the tourism is going to almost zero. You know, tourism in Morocco is somewhere between 8 and 20% if we add together all the sectors that are impacted by tourism. So we're talking between 80 and 20% of GDP. In Tunisia, we're talking between 7 and 15% of GDP. So tourism is actually collapsing in both countries. You add to that as well the exports of phosphate, which is very important both in Morocco and in Tunisia. That's falling down because of all the blockades that are now being imposed from all over the world, not least by India, which is a major importer of phosphate. In Algeria, actually, the economy was already flashing red for several years, since more or less since 2014, which was due, one, to the political situation that we all know of the last few years, but also to the issues that were happening already at the level of the oil industry and the collapsing prices of the recent years. So this is, I mean, what is happening today is being added to major crises that are already taking place. Now, regarding the measures that these countries are taking, the economic measures at least that these countries are taking, here you don't have these massive surplus in central banks where states can provide money to the impacted sectors easily, not least because of what I mentioned about the informal sector. It's very hard to find people who work in the informal sector and give them money. Many of these people do not even have bank accounts. So the states have been trying to do what they could. So we see in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, for instance, there were massive calls by the authorities to private companies to participate in setting up local funds to counter the socio-economic impacts of the pandemic, to buy medical staff, to build field hospitals. And this is happening, but it is still very limited. In some cases, in Tunisia, for instance, the state Tunisian officials almost threatened the heads of the private sectors that they may impose harsh measures on them to contribute more in this. Also, we see that Morocco, Tunisia, and even Algeria are asking for liquidity from the IMF. Morocco just got a credit line of around 3 billion. Tunisia got around $750 million. Morocco also, as I said, $3 billion. Tunisia, $750 million. Algeria, it is still in negotiations, but it will probably get a grant or get a credit line from the IMF. These countries also turned to the EU. Morocco just got around 440 million euros from the European Investment Bank. Tunisia just got 250 million also to fight the COVID-19 crisis. And this is helping, but this is definitely not enough. Therefore, again on the economy for 2020, as I said, the economy will shrink, foreign reserves will decrease, there will be major budget deficits in all these countries, and the national currencies will be probably devaluated at some point, and also inflation will mount. This means that these countries will face an economic recession and the social and political consequences that this will have. So now I move to the social and political implications of this crisis in these countries. As I said, the fact that half of the economy is in the informal sector means that a lot of people are now without jobs because of the lockdown. They are supposedly at home, but if I walk around me here, I see people outside sitting idle, just not doing anything because from one side they cannot go to work, from the other usually they live in very small houses, so you see a lot of young people who end up sitting outside, and when you overhear them, they're often complaining about this situation and quite angry about what the government is doing. There were a few demonstrations, so far quite limited in Tunisia and in Morocco, but the longer this crisis is, the worse, the more we will see of these demonstrations. The reforms that the Tunisian and Moroccan governments were undertaking in the level of the economy and politics, and here I mean mainly the democratic transition and the fight against corruption, will actually slow down, especially in Morocco, where a strong central state continues to exist. In Algeria, the Hirak, which animated the civil life of the country for the last year, is now dead. It's put on the shelves. No one is going out. Even strong supporters of the Hirak now accept that they need to step back. In Libya, the political implication is more militarily than political. In Libya, we see both sides trying to exploit the current situation, meaning to exploit the situation where the international community is looking at COVID-19 and also where their neighbors are actually worried about COVID-19 to make additional gains. I will talk about this later in my second talk, but currently the two protagonists in Libya are increasing their fight, and they're making things worse in the country. In also what we see is more in terms of political implication, we'll see more dependency by these countries, be it Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, or Morocco. We will see more dependency to the richer and more advanced nations. So, and here I'm talking about the long-term issues that this represents, because after so many years of independence, these countries will end up looking back to richer countries to help them. And here that means either the usual partners, meaning the European countries that are much closer, or the other big players. And as you all know, China is advancing more and more. So I'm really depicting a very bleak situation, because at least that's how I see it currently. There is, if we're looking for solutions, we don't see any aid coming from these countries to each other. So they are not helping each other. There are no mechanisms like, of course, there was a lot of criticism about the European Union in regards to this, and about the lack of cooperation between European countries. But when you look at here in North Africa, there is basically no help at all coming from Algeria to Tunisia, or from Tunisia to Morocco, and so on. And also not even cooperation at the level of health, of public health, and research. So this is quite a bleak scenario that I think it looks like what we see in other places in the world. And currently, maybe the only hope is that one, there will, or at least the two only hopes are actually that either this situation will not, either there will be a solution to the COVID-19, so maybe a cure or something basic could be found in the upcoming weeks, or that at least the trend that we see currently, which is to have a limited number of cases and deaths, will continue in this part of the world, because otherwise it will be very hard to keep people inside and to keep the lockdown. There will be, if things continue as they are, there will be social explosions in all these countries. And I think I'll finish here with this update on COVID-19, and I'll move to the second talk. Should we take a break, or do I go directly there?
For the moment, it seems that we don't have any questions. So if you wish, you can go directly to the second topic, and then we'll let people have some time to think about some questions.
Yeah. Okay. So here is the major part of my intervention today, which is about the Gulf. I mean, not only the Gulf, but rather the intra-Sunni conflict, and how it is being repercussioned in North Africa, and meaning in the Maghreb especially. So I'll start by this general introduction. You know that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Qatar have competed in North Africa since 2011, be it through financial investments or through the cultivation of political clients and military proxies. And this is driven by three main reasons. And I think this is the most important part in what I'm going to say. So three main reasons. One is countering Qatar for one side, or supporting Qatar and its foreign policy from the other. The second, which is related to this first point, it's about countering political Islam from the same side, or supporting political Islam for the other side. And the third point, which mainly applies for Turkey, it's about investments and economic gains, meaning that Turkey here is actually the one that is benefiting the most, at least in regards to its GDP, from its investments in the region, and the one that wants to have to gain the most from its involvement in this region. Here, Qatar and Turkey, the political influence of Qatar and Turkey peaked in the first 2 years following the Arab uprisings. So between 2011 and 2013, it was as if this was all Qatar and Turkey. And their allies took leading positions in the transitions of Libya, of Egypt, of Tunisia, of Morocco. We've seen all this Muslim Brotherhood type of Islamist party winning in elections and forming governments. But then, as you know, in 2013, a lot of events happened in the region. So the role of Qatar started shrinking then. There was first of all, the coup in Egypt by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. There was also the withdrawal of Ennahda from power in the same year, actually. Ennahda left and gave the place for a technocratic government. And there was a few months later, it was mainly in 2014, actually, there was a state collapse in Libya. So the countries that looked the closest to Turkey and Qatar were actually changing course. And what happened then, when the political role of Qatar did shrink, the Qataris looked to secure whatever they gained, and in terms of investments, also in terms of political gains. And here, actually, they're the only places where they were able to keep some leverage were Tunisia, to some extent Western Libya, but Western Libya had its myriad of problems, and also Morocco, but Morocco we'll talk about it later. What happened then when the role of Qatar shrunk, Turkey actually, which was the other ally in this coalition of two countries, the coalition of Turkey and Qatar, Turkey, which was more powerful because it had strong coordination with Qatar, because also of the Gulf crisis of 2017, when Turkey actually had had sent soldiers actually to save the Qatari monarchy. Turkey became the leading part of the coalition, and this meant that in the years that followed, mainly in 2017, and we see it clearly in 2017, 18, 19, 20, there is some kind of a division of labor between Turkey and Qatar when dealing with not only with North Africa, but it applies very well in North Africa. So Turkey was in charge of anything political and military, and Qatar took over the financial and the media part. And when I say media, it's media disinformation, propaganda. So these go together. When we look at the other camp, the Saudi Emirati camp, we see that they've been expanding since 2013. So when the role of Qatar decreased, their role increased. We saw that in Egypt when they backed the regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. We see that also in Libya, and especially in eastern Libya. And then when the forces of General Khalifa Haftar started advancing and making more and more gains, the power of these two countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, became very clear. So the two countries actually poured billions of dollars into Egypt after its coup. The Emiratis have been arming proxies and intervening militarily in Libya. Their disinformation machines were actually waging campaigns in Libya, in Tunisia, in Algeria, Morocco, and so on. So now I will go through the 5 Maghrebi countries one by one and describe what has been happening there especially in the last few years, because I think this will be the most interesting part for you. What happened since the 2017 Gulf crisis when the embargo against Qatar started. So I'll start by Libya, not just because Libya is the first country when we come from, not just because Libya is the first country in the Maghreb when we come from the east, but also because Libya is actually the epicenter of the intra-Sunni Cold War, the global epicenter, not just in North Africa. The weak state structure of Libya transformed it into a battleground. This means that the foreign involvement in the country went so high that it actually led, or at least it contributed largely in dividing the country into two. Today, Libya hosts an Emirati military airport in the east, Al-Khadem Airport. Libya also hosts Turkish garrisons in the west. Several Libyan leaders live in exile, either in Turkey or in Qatar or in the UAE. And today, the most recent manifestation of the intra-Sunni Cold War effort is the air war that is taking place in Libyan skies between drones, actually. Some of them are provided by the UAE to Haftar's army, and they are of Chinese models. The others are given to the Tripoli government by Turkey, and these are actually Turkey-made drones. This game of drones, if we can call it, is probably the biggest drone war theater in the world, according to the former UN Special Envoy to Libya. In 2019 alone, for instance, more than 1,000 drone strikes were recorded in the country. Every week, I think, and these things are public. We see all the pictures and all the stories on Twitter and online. Every week, you see maybe 1 or 2 drones that are shut down by one side or the other, etc. So what happened is, by this involvement in Libya by these Sunni countries, they did sabotage the peace efforts that the international community tried in the country, or that some local organizations and local parties tried. In the last year alone, all the UN efforts were broken by the different protagonists. So, for instance, if you look at April 2019, that was so exactly a year ago, that was when General Haftar started his campaign against Tripoli. And he started the attack, he started bombing Tripoli exactly the same day when the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres landed in the country. So this, I think, never happened before, such a disdain to the international community and to the United Nations. That week, actually, that week there was supposed in April 2019 a big conference of peace in Libya was supposed to take place. So the invasion by Haftar did topple that process. And the reason why he acted like this is because he was entirely emboldened by Arab and Western support. 1 week before the attack, he was in Saudi Arabia, where he met with the king and the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And also, a few days after his attack started, he had a phone call with the American President Donald Trump. And by the way, this week there is a very good article in the New York Times about this famous phone call and how it went. So he got emboldened, and he thought that he was going to win in a matter of weeks, but the war is still going on. Later, by the end of 2019, Germany took the initiative and tried to bring all the international actors on the same table, to the negotiating table, and a temporary agreement was sealed. But what happened is that the Emiratis and the Turks kept arming their allies in the country, and actually in unprecedented dimensions. So between January and March 2020, for instance, flight trackers recorded more than 100 cargo plane flights between the UAE and Benghazi, the headquarters of General Haftar. It was also recorded a smaller number of planes and ships originating from Turkey were also recorded. There is also an influx of mercenaries in the last few months that were sent or paid for by these different Sunni players. So we're talking about more than 3,000 Sudanese mercenaries, more than 600 Russian mercenaries, hundreds of pro-Assad Syrians who were flown in by Russia to fight with General Haftar. And according to the French journal Le Monde, citing French intelligence sources, some of the mercenaries, of these groups of mercenaries, were paid by Saudi Arabia. There are also thousands of Syrian mercenaries that Turkey brought. And here we have more or less an army of more than 10,000 mercenaries present in Libya and paid by either the Gulf or the Turkish states. The ceasefire, therefore, didn't last long. So even though there was this kind of agreement in early 2020, very quickly General Haftar started advancing again towards Tripoli. And that led actually to the resignation of the UN Special Envoy, Ghassan Salame, in early March. He said that it was because of health issues, but it was largely because of his incapacity to do anything when it comes to countering these different players in Libya. Recently, when the COVID-19 crisis began, there was some hope that the protagonists would calm down. And actually, they declared that they declared the new ceasefire in March. But here again, the Tripoli government took the opportunity to stage another attack, emboldened by the Turkish support that they have. Turkish support that includes not only the drones that they've been sending them in the last year, but also new variety of drones, a new variety of jammers that actually can take the drones down, and even warships stationed near the Libyan shores. And now we see the GNA again advancing against Haftar. So the war is going on in Libya. The country is divided, and that's largely because of these Gulf and countries and Turkey. Now, from Libya, we move to its neighboring country, Tunisia, which is and which has been balancing between the Gulf countries and Turkey for the last several years. Balancing is actually the foreign policy of Tunisia, or the main principle of the foreign policy of Tunisia. The country is actually quite poor as an economy. Its economy is actually much smaller than that of Libya or Algeria or Morocco, and Tunisian authorities are always looking for funding from Gulf countries. In the last few years, Tunisia got actually closer to Qatar, but also it is in good terms with Saudi Arabia. It only has issues with the United Arab Emirates, and the level of involvement of these countries is quite different from what we saw in Libya. Here in Tunisia, it's not really on the military or the political level, but more on financing and investments, and also on the disinformation level. We see a lot of disinformation taking place in Tunisia that originates either in the UAE or in Qatar mostly. And this is actually contributing to the political polarization that we saw in the country since 2011. Now, when we look at the relationship between Tunisia and these countries, we see that Qatar is the most important Arab investor in the country, and maybe the second largest foreign direct investor after France. But here we're not talking about major investments. It's providing jobs, it's pumping cash in Tunisia's central bank, but it is still quite limited. Turkey is also an important investor in the country, and the economic relations are quite important. Turkey is actually what I mentioned earlier in the division of labor, because of Turkey's role in providing military and security support. In Tunisia, it's also doing that. It's giving the military and security forces a lot of its products, including drones, either selling them or giving them under grants. The visits between officials are actually frequent. Just recently, in December of last year, Erdogan visited Tunisia. A year before, also Erdogan was in Tunisia. And when he visited in December 2019, he was actually the first head of state to visit the country since the election of the current president, Qais Said. And 2 months later, it was the Emir of Qatar, Tamim, who visited Tunisia, to become actually the second foreign head of state to visit the country since the election of Qais Said. So this shows a little bit how close the relationship is. When it comes to the UAE, however, the relationship remains tense. Qatar and Qatari and Pro and Nahda social media often accuse the UAE of plotting against Tunisia, plotting to destabilize Tunisia, and there are a lot of stories about what the UAE is doing in Tunisia. The strongman of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, hasn't met with any Tunisian leader in the last 5 years, and no Tunisian high-level official was invited to Abu Dhabi in this period. So when we compare this to Qatar, we see a very striking difference. And maybe here the main thing is that for Qatar, Ennahda is an important component in the Tunisian political spectrum. For Qatar and Turkey, Ennahda is an important component of the Tunisian political spectrum, and because of their close ties, that explains the deep ties that they have with Tunisia. For the UAE, on the contrary, as long as Ennahda is in power, Tunisia will remain blacklisted. And this, I think, is, if we take the last 10 years, this is a fact that now we almost take for granted. Now, the curious part is the relationship with Saudi Arabia. One would expect Saudi Arabia to be as cold with Tunisia as the UAE, but it is not. In the last 5 years, I would say, there were dozens of high-level visits. That includes the King Salman himself, that includes his crown prince twice, that includes several ministers, officials from the army, from the police. Also, the Tunisian prime minister was invited to Saudi Arabia. Several Tunisian officials were invited to Saudi Arabia. And actually, there are a few moments that show how the relationship works. So, for instance, in December 2018, if you remember, that was a few weeks after Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, was killed in Turkey by Saudi agents in the Saudi consulate. By then, all the accusations were towards Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So Mohammed bin Salman tried to break the ice, or break the embargo that was being imposed on him informally by most countries in the world, and went on a visit to a number of countries. These were Bahrain, Egypt, of course, the UAE, and one of the countries he visited was Tunisia. Tunisia, there was actually a small demonstration here in Tunisia against his visit, but still, he was able to visit Tunisia to meet with the president. He was welcomed actually at the airport by the Tunisian president, and he left. He stayed maybe 2 hours in Tunisia and he left. But he marked the point, and he played on that very well in his propaganda. That, look, I'm accepted in Tunisia and I can travel to Tunisia, etc. So after his tour, he invited the Tunisian prime minister to visit Saudi Arabia, and there the Saudis pledged around $900 million in financial aid to Tunisia. So it seems that this thing of accepting Mohammed bin Salman in the country did help. Later, when Tunisia hosted the Arab League summit in April 2019, that was partly thanks to Saudi backing, and that's when King Salman visited the country. So it seems, on the contrary of the UAE, the Saudis are fine with the current status quo in Tunisia. They are not very close to Ennahda, but for instance, when they invited the Prime Minister of Tunisia to visit Saudi Arabia, they invited with him his Minister of International Cooperation, who by then was the Secretary General of Ennahda. And he was actually seated in the table right next to the King of Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis do not seem to have an issue with Ennahda party, even though they have issues with other Muslim Brotherhood leaders in other countries. For them, as long as the Tunisian leaders refrain from criticizing Saudi Arabia, and as long as they do not, Tunisia does not forge close ties with Iran, which is their main issue in the world, they are fine with the current status quo. And now I'll move to the next country, which is Algeria. Algeria, the hegemon of the Maghreb, the most important military power and the richest country in North Africa. Algeria has limited annual transactions with the Gulf countries, a little more with Turkey, but still that's limited. These are not its most important partners. The Saudis and the Emiratis pledged to invest heavily in Algeria, but that is still limited. There are some important investments on steel, for instance. There is a competition in Algeria between Qatari and Emirati firms in the production of steel. There is also a joint factory of military production between the UAE and Algeria, based in Algeria. So there are a few examples of close ties, but that's quite limited. And Algeria, actually, traditionally, Algeria was always close to Russia and to a certain extent to Iran. So on the opposite camp of the Gulf countries. Algeria also has a lot of disagreements historically with Saudi Arabia and the UAE on oil production. So at OPEC, it's usually on the other side of the table. And they also disagree when it comes to Libya. I mentioned how the strategy of these countries in Libya is, and that Algeria is completely opposed to, because one, Algeria wants a political solution in Libya, and two, because it's worried of Egyptian and Emirati involvement in its immediate regional security complex. So recently there were fears that there were stories or rumors that the Algerians were getting closer to the UAE, especially last year when Bouteflika was toppled. There were signs, for instance, when the Algerian president picked Saudi Arabia as his first visit abroad, when he kicked out of the country the CEO of Ooredoo, the Qatari telecom giant. But still, he also did host the Turkish foreign minister and the Turkish president, the Turkish president actually was the first head of state to visit Algeria since the election of President Tebboune. The Emir Tamim also visited Algeria in February, and therefore we see that Algeria is playing a different game than the other countries, and that's due to the fact that it's well-organized military institution, its traditional nationalist and sovereignist policies, and its economic power. They do limit foreign meddling. Algiers wants to play with the major interventionist Sunni regimes according to its own rules and not to theirs. And here it's very different from all the other countries in North Africa. And my last two countries are Morocco and Mauritania. And here the position of Morocco is perhaps the most curious one when it comes to especially when it comes to the Gulf crisis of 2017. Morocco is traditionally and historically very close to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but it took a position when the embargo against Qatar was announced. It took a position that was seen as pro-Qatar, sending actually food to Qatar, and there were also a lot of high-level visits between the two countries, the king, the emir, prime minister, and so on. And this was surprising for many. But actually, if we look at the last few years, there were signs of disagreements between Morocco and the Saudis and the Emiratis. So for instance, last year, Morocco withdrew from the coalition in Yemen. Morocco also withdrew its ambassador from the UAE. The UAE did the same. Morocco, for a short while, actually withdrew its ambassador from Riyadh. When Mohammed bin Salman visited Tunisia in 2018, he was not accepted in Morocco. And for the last 3 years, King Salman stopped going to Morocco in summer, even though he used to go there every year, and it was an important economic and political gain for Morocco. So there was a call here, and that's partly due to the fact that Morocco was expecting much more investments by the Saudis and the Emiratis, but that didn't materialize. The Qataris, however, were very aggressive in investing in Morocco. They did a lot of things, such as taking down visas for Moroccans who visit Qatar. And the Qataris also supported Morocco in hosting the important Khirat agreement about Libya a few years ago, which gave Morocco an important political and diplomatic role in the world. And therefore, the Qataris were very aggressive, while the Moroccans were actually angry against the Saudis and the Emiratis. However, because the Moroccans know that they are very important in North Africa, and that they are too big to be. They're not like Tunisia. So it's not that we're not talking about the same size. So the Moroccans can know that the Saudis and the Emiratis will not abandon them. So they are rising the bets, and I think they are succeeding in this game of balancing between the two sides in the Gulf, and much less with Turkey. Their relationship is not as close as it is with the Gulf countries, and I think they're succeeding. And I'll conclude briefly by Mauritania, which is the poorest country in the Maghreb, the smallest economy in the Maghreb. Mauritania is actually traditionally close to Saudi Arabia, and therefore, when the Gulf crisis of 2017 started, it automatically joined the Saudi Emirati axis. Since then, there are a lot of high-level visits. There was also a transition, if you are following Mauritanian politics, a transition between two presidents, a transition that was peaceful, and a transition between actually a former general and a civilian president. It was not, there were elections, but not the freest elections you can think of. So it was really a transition under control, and the Saudis and the Emiratis were praising it. And I think they looked at it as an example with which they would counter the examples that we saw in Libya or in Tunisia, which in their regard is more chaotic. And also it's a transition that didn't have any political Islam component. So they are very happy with Morocco, and recently the Emiratis announced an investment of $2 billion in Mauritania. As I said, Mauritania has the smallest economy in North Africa, and its GDP is 5 billion. So imagine an investment of 2 billion in an economy of $5 billion. Therefore, Mauritania, I think, is, when we look at all these countries, it's the one that is closer to one side and not the other, and it will continue to be this way. To conclude here, I would say that from what we saw, Libya will remain the junction point. Libya will remain the battleground for all these countries. Tunisia and Morocco will keep balancing, but the situation in Libya and what will happen in Libya can impact Tunisia in the future. We can dig in deeper in the Q&A. Algeria will keep its distances, trying to play by its own rules, and Mauritania will remain, as I said, in the Saudi Emirati orbit. The only question mark here is what will happen now that the COVID-19 is advancing slowly in the region, and what will happen now that after the big oil crash that we witnessed this year, because this means that the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Turks, the Qataris will have much less energy and much less money to help their proxies and allies and to intervene in these countries. So will that mean less polarization in Tunisia? Will that mean less divisions in Libya? Will that mean a better future for North African countries? But this is a big question mark, because we really don't know where things are heading when it comes to these two things. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Youssef. Thank you a lot for this panoramic vision of the situation in the region, both regarding the coronavirus crisis and the intra-Sunni Cold War, and the links you made between both topics. Very interesting. Now it seems that we have lots of questions. Maybe we could start for the questions regarding the coronavirus crisis. If you agree, we could take 2 or 3 questions, and then you answer them, and we move to other questions, because there are a lot now. Very interesting topic. We have a question from Katerina, who is asking what is the perception in the region about the so-called Chinese mass diplomacy. For example, we have another question from Colin, who is asking if this crisis is nevertheless going to enhance the regional cooperation between Northern African states.
So when it comes to the, should I start?
Yeah, please. We can make two and then move to other questions.
Yeah. So when it comes to Katarzyna's question, I think it's related to her most recent report. When it comes to the mass diplomacy, it was positively received, at least when I look at what was said in Tunisia and Algeria. That was seen as part of the cooperation, South-South cooperation, etc., etc. So I think here again, like in Europe and elsewhere, the Chinese played well the propaganda card and it was not only the Chinese government, but also the private initiatives from the Chinese. And here, I think, although I think the Europeans gave more when it comes to at least financially, much more than the Chinese, but the Chinese knew how to frame it, and it's having a very positive. There is a very positive reaction here, and I didn't see any backlash against this. And even we. I mean, on the same topic, there were a few cases of racism against Chinese or against Asians in general in this part of the world, but that was very limited. And actually, in Algeria, where there are tens of thousands of Chinese workers, we haven't seen any issue when it comes to Chinese. So all in all, I think the Chinese keep a positive image in the region. When it comes to cooperation between Maghreb countries, I think I mentioned this briefly. Sadly, there is very little of this. We see much more cooperation between and much more coordination between Tunisian and French officials, between Moroccan and European officials. But we don't see North African ministers meeting, or at least, or maybe meeting on Zoom. We haven't seen any such meeting or any such coordination. I think it's very possible. I think it's very easy. I think it could be an opportunity to bridge the gap between Algeria and Morocco. But for the moment, each one of these countries is actually looking more inward and looking to the traditional partner. And in this regard, it's mainly Europe.
Thank you. We have a question from Paula Rodriguez, who's asking about the Moroccan-Spanish relation and the moment that Morocco closed the border with Spain. She's asking do you think that this will have consequences in the future in the bilateral relation between both countries?
Well, I think, I mean, now with the new world of COVID-19, it's as if we're doing a reset and going towards a new situation. So whatever happened in this period will not necessarily impact the relationship between the different countries. Now, when it comes to Spain and Morocco, I mean, it's not such a big issue at this point, and we've seen recently Morocco actually getting closer to the EU by having Borrell as the High Commissioner in the High Representative in the EU. I think future ties between Morocco and Spain will rather go on the positive direction. But again, the current situation is actually very changing, and it's like a reset mode. What we will see afterwards will be completely different from what we had before.
Thank you. We have another question about coronavirus crisis from Colin, who's asking about the impact of this crisis on the democratic transition in Tunisia. Is it going to be let's say a backlash in the transition due to the government response, And also in relation with the topic of human rights and democratization, we have another question by Kentan about the hierarchy in Algeria. How do you see the situation there? Is the hierarchy going to increase the intensity after the lockdown and the economic and social situation worsens? Well, what do you think about these issues?
So when it comes to Tunisia, I think there is a risk. There is a serious risk because the current situation is actually creating a lot of discontent, creating a lot of angry people among everyone, both the young, older people, those who are pro-democracy, those who are pro-authoritarianism. And of course, the main accusation here that you hear is that it's because we are in democracy that, or because we are not imposing harsh measures, that people are not respecting the lockdown and the curfew, and so we need more authoritarian manners to put people in their homes and to impose the rules. There is also people who are saying that the current democratic government is not able to provide alternatives, to provide solutions, and therefore it's because, and this is due to the weakness of the democratic modes of government. Then you have, from the other side, those who are pro-authoritarianism, bringing in the Chinese model as the most successful model, and therefore I think again, we don't know how long this crisis will last, but if we continue in the current lockdown, I would say definitely we will have a lot of demonstrations by the end of the year, even before the end of the year, and we may see stronger elements of the police, the army, saying that we need to find a solution. And I think this is not only in Tunisia, but everywhere in the region. We're talking about these things even in the US, and the authoritarian turn that American politics are taking with the current crisis. When it comes, so the risk is very strong, which would be very sad for a country that is the only democracy of the region and the only successful democratic model in the region. When it comes to Algeria and the Hirak, it's actually quite similar. Although the Hirak itself, as a pro-democracy movement, stopped, the people are very angry. And the more the lockdown continues, the more casualties, the more cases and deaths we will see in Algeria, the more people will be angry, and maybe in a few months we will see again massive demonstrations. But the fear here is that these won't be demonstrations calling for reform or calling for more democracy, but just demonstrations of angry people, angry demonstrations. And again, this is something that we may witness in all over the world. So here, be it for Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco, I think the state needs to find the states need to find solutions that are adequate to their population. And, I don't know whether the current lockdown is the best solution. It's working more or less in the northern hemisphere, but maybe in the southern hemisphere, with the important informal sector that these countries have, there needs to be new models, so that people are less angry, and to avoid to avoid a massive explosion.
Thank you for your answer. Now, if you want, we can move to the other topic of the conference, even though they are interconnected. We have a question from Emmanuel. He's saying, "Hi, Youssef. Hi, everyone. You mentioned disinformation campaigns in Tunisia. Could you think about an example? Could you provide us an example about these disinformation campaigns in Tunisia, please?"
Yeah. So, for instance, in 2017 or 2018, but probably 2017 when the Gulf crisis started. Right after the Gulf crisis started, there was there was a leak, supposedly a leak from an Emirati think tank or Emirati government agency. And the leak was a document that supposedly shows how the Emiratis are staging revolution in Tunisia and how they are telling their people in Tunisia or how they are advising to tell their people in Tunisia to stage demonstrations and attack Ennahda and so on. And this very quickly went on the media outlets that are funded or close to Qatar. So Arabi 21 is one of them. And in Tunisia, in some media outlets that are known and social media that are known to be very close to Ennahda. So this was maybe a few days after the Gulf crisis started. That same week, by the end of that week, there was a press conference by the spokesperson of the Libyan National Army, I mean, the spokesperson of Khalifa Haftar in Libya. And in that press conference that was on Al Arabiya and then reproduced by many Emirati and Saudi media outlets, the spokesperson said that they received information that there is Qatari money going to Tunisian bank and then forwarded to the Libyan mercenaries and terrorist organizations. And of course, that, as I said, was on Al Arabiya and Sky News Arabia and these media outlets. And very quickly it went viral among media and social media in Tunisia that are known to be opposed to Ennahda. So this happened in a week, but then I can give you a number of these examples. I wrote a book chapter on this actually. There are a number of these examples that it's almost like a ping pong match between the two sides. Maybe there is some part of truth. I mean, be it conspiracy theory or disinformation, you usually have one part that is true and one part that is either completely fake or a pure amplification. But this is deepening the polarization in the country.
We have another question on this regional struggle. We have a question by Fadi, who is asking about the relation between Iran and on the one hand and Qatar and Turkey on the other hand, and how is this playing in the region?
Mm-hmm. So what we saw in the, I mean, if we were maybe 5 years ago, this relationship was quite bad, although Turkey and Qatar always had some relations with Iran. But at least in their media, they used to attack each other. In Syria, they were funding, and they are still funding, very opposed groups. But since the 2017 crisis, actually, Iran was proactive in supporting Qatar and in breaking the embargo against Qatar, which means that from 2017 until now, there are some cordial ties between Iran and Qatar and Turkey. It doesn't mean that they are an alliance, not at all. As I said, I mean, in Syria, they are still funding different groups and groups that are killing each other. But in terms of when it comes to fighting or to opposing Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Turkey, Qatar, and Iran are on the same side. When it comes to the region, to North Africa, Iran actually has very limited influence and very limited reach. Iran is mostly in the Middle East, to a certain extent in the Horn of Africa, but North Africa is actually quite far away from Iran's reach, and it doesn't have any proxies. Although in the last few years we've heard of new groups of new Shia converts, and these are usually you know, the new Shia converts end up in a way or the other following the Iranian the Iranian foreign policy. So I've never heard of any Shia convert who is opposed to Iran as an expansionist state, or opposed to Iran in the name of human rights, etc., etc. So we have a few Shia converts there, but very few. Their role is actually amplified by some political groups especially in Tunisia and Morocco. Some political groups who want to be positively seen by the Saudis. So I've heard several times people from Ennahda or from the PJD in Morocco speaking about the Shia threat, as they call it, in their respective countries, and that actually makes them look good in front of the Saudis. There was also not so long ago, I think 2 or 3 years ago, a story when the Moroccans accused Iran of supporting Hezbollah, of bringing weapons to Algeria, to the Western Sahara fighters. I don't know to which extent that's true. I mean, again, this is like most of these stories. You have one part of truth and one part of fake and one part of amplification. But I think all in all, the role of Iran is actually quite limited in the region. And one last thing about this, and I've heard it from Tunisian officials in the last, since the Arab Spring, the Iranians actually tried to get closer to Tunisia. They invited several Tunisian officials. They wanted to deepen their ties with Tunisia, but the Tunisians actually were very cautious, and they didn't allow them, and that allowed Tunisia to have the close ties that I mentioned with Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. We have a question from the YouTube chat by Harry Robson, who is asking about the EU, and he's asking actually if any of these states from the Maghreb region are using the EU to balance again the Gulf countries and Turkey.
Not really. I think the EU is very strong when it comes to development, but it is not seen as, it's not necessarily seen as a strong political actor in this region. So I think that's why it's quite hard to balance with an economic power against a military and political power that are the Gulf countries and Turkey. And I think it's rather the other way around. I think the North African countries are, whenever the EU is putting pressure when it comes to asking them to sign these free trade agreements that North African countries often see as going against their interests, or as going more in the interests of the EU, or when the EU puts pressure when it comes to the usual conditionality that the EU puts when it comes to democracy, human rights, rule of law, etc. I think that's when the North African countries tell the EU, well, anyway, we can look elsewhere. We can look at our Gulf allies in Turkey, and we don't need your money and your pressures. So yeah, I think it's going that way rather than the other way.
We have another question about the coronavirus, going back to the other crisis. Batul is asking, who do you think are the countries that are going to recover more rapidly from this crisis?
In North Africa, well, I think I would say Tunisia, because it has it's seen as having one of the best healthcare system in Africa, which doesn't mean that it's good. I mean, in terms of, I don't have the figures here, but in terms of beds available or the hospitals themselves, we see they're lacking a lot of things, but still As I said, it's seen comparatively to other African countries, it's faring much better. So I think it will recover better if there is no massive social issues in following the lockdown. So again, I mean, in Tunisia, I'm more worried about the economic effect and the repercussion on the social and political structure more than the health issues themselves. Morocco, maybe, but I think from what we see now, at least from the figures that I've seen, Morocco is also having a lot of difficulties in its health system, and be it Morocco or Algeria, the political regimes there did not, I mean, still have a lot of issues, and therefore there is actually an even bigger risk of social tensions than in Tunisia. And the one that will, Mauritania is actually quite small, so I think that's manageable. And the one that will do the worst, I think, will be Libya because of the civil war that is taking place. Again, if coronavirus advances in Libya, that will be a serious issue, not only for Libyans, but for North Africans in general.
Also on Libya, we had another question by Colin, who was asking about the most recent military events, about the losses of the Libyan National Army in Sabratha, for example. Colin is asking if do you think that Haftar will go back to the negotiating table after these setbacks?
It's very possible. Now, when it comes to Libya, things change very quickly. The recent advances by the GNA, the Government of National Accord, they are partly due to the Turkish backing that I mentioned, but they are also partly due to new alliances that were formed between the GNA and some local groups in Western Libya. So these alliances shift very quickly, and in a few weeks you can get a complete reversal of the alliances and have also Haftar gaining ground again. Also, because the UAE is actually keeping its aid to Haftar, it doesn't mean that by he's losing anything serious. He's still very strong. He's still controlling an important part of the country. So I would be cautious about the recent gains of the GNA. Now, in theory, because he lost recently, because of the COVID-19 crisis, he would go to the negotiation table. But in practice, because of the very quickly changing alliances, because also Haftar is quite stubborn, he's known to be quite stubborn, and because the different backers, meaning the UAE and Turkey, do not seem to be discussing at all, I think sadly the situation will continue as it is until either he loses seriously and is obliged to withdraw, and then he will negotiate, or it will continue several other months until maybe the COVID-19 obliged everyone to step down.
Also, I think we have another question relating to Libya, but this one is about the migration crisis. So how do you think this other crisis is affecting this macro geopolitical struggle, and more specifically in Libya? And what is the relation between this crisis and the EU relation with the Maghreb?
So when it comes to migration, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think the number of migrants decreased in the recent weeks. In Tunisia, the joke now is that there is a discount on boats that go to Italy to take migrants. because there is less and less people. First of all, there is the lockdown and curfew, so it's quite hard now to drive between to drive in roads and go to one place or the other. And two, people, I mean, again, because of the fear that people have now when they look at the news about what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, there is less people willing to cross the Mediterranean. So I think we see a decrease in migration. It doesn't mean that, but this is quite temporary, I think. Now, when it comes to EU, to the EU North Africa, I think the EU is very much aware that if there is a major outbreak of COVID-19 in its southern borders, then one, that means that's an issue right next door, and two, that means that there will be more migrants coming and perhaps coming with COVID-19. So what we will see, and that's why we've seen very quickly European banks giving hundreds of millions of dollars to the countries in their southern hemisphere, and I think the EU will, once the apex of the crisis decreases in the EU, I think the next place to look at is North Africa, and the EU will be focusing more and more on the health infrastructure in North Africa, maybe more than any other sector.
Thank you so much, Youssef, for all these reflections and answering all the questions. Maybe to conclude, I had two questions myself. One on the coronavirus crisis, and the other one on the intra-Sunni Cold War. And the first one, I was actually thinking that this is maybe not the time to be positive at all, given, as you were saying, the different levels at which the virus can impact the Maghreb societies because of the economic situation, because of the political situation, and of course, because of the war in Libya. Maybe it's not the best time for optimists, but I was thinking, do we have a window of opportunity now? First, in terms of cooperation, I think that there was already a question about this. And then, is it time to rethink how we reflect on international relations, about the discipline itself? Because to me, it seems that for many years we have been losing track of very important issues such as global health, public health systems, or care as an interesting topic in international relations. Is it time to think a little bit, to reflect a little bit on these issues, even if the events are there and we have to keep on analyzing them? Or, I mean, do we have the good tools to analyze the current events? And moving to the intra-Sunni Cold War in the region, I was wondering, could you expand a little bit more about the role of the EU in the Libyan crisis? Because recently the EU announced the creation of this new naval operation, Irini is called now, and actually one of the mandates of the operation is to control the UN embargo of arms. But at the same time, you were mentioning that there's this Game of Thrones, Game of Drones in Libya. And actually, the EU and the UN seem completely incapable to stop this. Could you elaborate a little bit on these issues, please?
Yeah.
Thank you again.
So when it comes to the window of opportunity, yes, there is a very important window of opportunity, but it is still closed. Or there is actually room of opportunity, but the door is closed. Because as you see, I mean, these countries, the first thing they did was to close their borders. I mean, going back to the earlier question about Spain and Morocco, the borders were closed everywhere. I mean, Europe closed its borders, North African countries closed their borders, but also they closed the borders among them and between them. And in the case of Tunisia and Algeria, there are families living on the two sides of the borders, and it was closed immediately. The mechanisms of cooperation are actually on standby now, but there should be a lot of cooperation, at least when it comes to the health sector. And here again, I mean, going back to your second point, that this is, as this crisis has proved, this can be and this should be the maybe one of the main focus of the international community when it comes to and of politicians in general, more than things that can be almost trivial in comparison to these other crises that we saw in the last few years, and all the energy that we spent on other crises are completely are nothing when it comes to what we see now. So yes, I mean, if you think of I don't know, things like between Tunisia and Algeria, sometimes there are disagreements about taxes on the border. Between Morocco and Spain, there are disagreements about an island in a rock in the sea. And all these things will look trivial today in comparison, and therefore there is definitely a need to rethink what are the priorities, what are the things that impact on the long run, and that need more cooperation, and that need more to be tackled more by the international community. Now, again, this is in theory, this is what should happen. But when we see that, when we see Trump cutting aid to the World Health Organization rather than looking for reforming it, when we look at how all these countries close their borders, what we're seeing now is rather less cooperation, and it's as if the world went from the first half of the 20th century, went from closed nations or closed empires to more cooperation that we've seen at the level of the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, etc. Which nothing was perfect. They had a lot of flaws, but at least there was more cooperation, and at least there was the ground for cooperation. Now it seems that we're going rather to close down everything, and to be even more trivial in how we deal with the important issues. So I think this time is when intellectuals, thinkers need to say this openly, to write about this, to push for more cooperation. But at least the current political class in the world is not, at least a major part of the current political class is not looking that way.
And my other question was about the role of the EU and the UN in the arms embargo in Libya. Are they capable of implementing that?
So no, first that's the easy answer, and we've seen from how the UN was trying in all sides with several envoys and with several conferences, and each time. Not to say that the UN didn't try. The UN, really, the United Nations was trying, but that ended up with the resignation of the UN Special Envoy, and I think he was the fourth Special Envoy since the crisis in Libya started, and there is no solution at sight. The EU, yes, they started this new naval mission. But if you look at the naval mission, and if you look at the comments by High Representative Borrell and other EU officials, they're often criticizing Turkey. And the naval mission is actually targeting Turkey because it's Turkey that comes by sea, while they almost do not say anything about the UAE or Egypt or Saudi Arabia. They blame Turkey, yes. And here we know the conflictual relationship between the EU and Turkey. They blame Russia as well a lot, even though Russia is maybe a minor player in Libya, but they barely blame the Emiratis, for instance. And this, I've seen it not only in their public statements, but in some closed meetings. It's very rare to hear Europeans blaming the Emiratis. So this this naval operation, which is targeting Turkey, I don't know to which extent it will be functional, because I don't see Turkey and the EU going in maritime confrontation. And actually, Turkey, when the Turks send shipments of weapons, they usually send their warships to protect them. So I don't think it's a very efficient role. And I think generally, as long, be it for the UN or the EU, as long as they don't tackle the international interference in Libya from its different sides, I think it will not work. So if they keep blaming one side and not blaming the other, or if they keep compromising with one side and being harsh on the other, I think it will not work. And sadly, this is what we are witnessing today in Libya.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have two last questions, if you allow so, Youssef. I think they are related. One is by Enrique Pons, who is asking about the Gulf countries and if they will finance Maghreb countries after this COVID-19 crisis. Mm-hmm. And the other question is also about the relation between both topics of your lecture. And Fadi is asking actually which one of the two coalitions of Gulf countries and in this intra-Sunni Cold War will be hit the most by the crisis, by the COVID crisis.
Yeah. So will they finance their proxies as much as before? I think if they are now, when we look at the Gulf countries mainly, they are hit by two things: the COVID-19 and the oil crash. So they're facing internally two big issues that will impact them both on the social level and on the economic level, which means that the current situation means that they will be much weaker in the upcoming months, and therefore they will change their strategy and change how they spend money. And this maybe is something good when it comes to Libya, because there will be much less money and energy coming from abroad, and be it from the Gulf countries or from Turkey. Turkey, of course, is not directly affected by the oil crash, but it's very badly hit by COVID-19. So in Libya, that's maybe good news. In Mauritania, that's maybe very bad news, because as I mentioned earlier, Mauritania got a lot of funding and a lot of grants from the Saudis and the Emiratis, and rely a lot on these funds. In Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, there is always the expectation of having more Gulf investments, but they've been coming less and less in the past few years. So this will not have a direct implication. And the second question, sorry?
The second question was about which one of the two groups of states that are confronted in this Cold War is going to be hit the most in the crisis.
So I think groups know, because, for instance, if you take Qatar and Turkey, it's Turkey that is going to be hit the most, as we see from the number of cases they have when it comes to COVID-19, the size of the country, the fact that it's very close to Europe and to Russia, where there is an important outbreak of COVID-19. So I think from that side, the Turkish-Qatari alliance will be hit hard. But from the other side, we see Saudi Arabia as well. And here, when it comes to Turkey, the numbers are more or less accurate. Of course, Turkey is a hybrid regime, but still there are some accurate data that we can get from Turkey. When it comes to the other side, so we have the UAE is quite small. So although there is an important outbreak there, but we're talking about a few hundreds of cases, and that's manageable. Then the UAE has enough funds to control the crisis, similarly to Qatar. But Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which are quite big countries of that axis, I think we hear more and more stories about high-level officials who are hit by COVID-19, and that means that the situation is worse than what is officially declared. So therefore, I think the two camps will be badly hit. But now, at least from the figures we have, I think the Saudi, Egyptian, Emirati camp will be worse hit than the other.
Thank you for the answer. I think now it's past day, so it's perfect timing, I would say, to end the conference here. Thank you very much, Youssef. Now at 8 is when we, I guess in Tunisia too, but in Spain is when we go to the balconies and we start applauding the health workers. So perfect timing. Thank you again, everybody, for following this conference, and take care.
Thank you, and I'll applaud with you the health workers. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.